For the first count of first-degree intentional homicide, Pickett could face 20 years to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And for mistreatment of animals for killing Chico, he could face 3.5 years. Sentencing is set for September 20th. Back to you.
Thanks, Joy, for that report. Joining me now to talk about this, criminal defense attorneys Joy Tamburino in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Carolyn Abernathy in Atlanta. Also joining us is psychiatrist and author Dr. Gayani DeSilva in Yorba Linda, California. Thank you all for being on this morning. This was the big news yesterday, the guilty verdict for Sean Pickett after 3 days of testimony, trial, and evidence in front of this jury. About that, first, let me play some sound from this defendant on the stand, and in particular, the words that he used when describing why he stabbed and killed his mother.
I didn't like walk in. I opened the door and then I kind of like fast walked into the room. So almost kind of like ran in, but I didn't.
Okay. And then you ran in and she came at you with a knife, and then what happened?
We wrestled over control of the knife. And which is surprising because she was a small woman, but I was very malnourished at the same time. She was very strong. We wrestled and fought over control of the knife, and instinctively and naturally, I got a hold of it once or twice, and we were still wrestling, and I just naturally stabbed her 2 times, I believe.
Dr. DeSilva, can you talk to us about the difference between him possibly having some issues, some mental health issues, but those not rising to the level of us hearing anything about it during this trial?
Sure. Well, Sean Pickett definitely has some mental problems, particularly of lying repeatedly. And that doesn't necessarily mean he has a clinical mental illness. He really needs a very good forensic psychiatric evaluation to determine if he has a clinical mental illness. And also he used the words, I was struck by the words he used of this natural instinct to defend himself, but actually children, even adult children, their natural instinct is to protect their parents, not to be the aggressor. And even if parents are aggressive or abusive to them, children at all ages, even a young adult, they tend to want to protect the parent or even take on responsibility for the parent's aggression on themselves. So it's really not a natural instinct for him to attack his mom or defend himself against his mother.
You know, and speaking of that natural instinct, there was a question that Joy Limnakran had for the boyfriend of the victim in this case, Susan Pickett, Ernest Wheeler, who she talked to, and he talked about the dog and the protection that the dog was giving at the time. If we have that clip, we could play it. And Dr. DeSilva, they likely will be able to bring in a mental health expert at this juncture, because we're not talking about the law, whether there's this legal diagnosis, but to give some context to his life. What do you expect that expert will hone in on in front of the judge?
Well, I was struck by his lack of taking responsibility. He is so easily able to lie and make up a whole new story, and he seems like he actually believes each of his stories. He told 3 different stories for what happened, and just had no other emotion about it. So I think that the forensic expert is going to take a look at his developmental history, his ability to relate to other people, his history of fire setting, his history of truancy, and his history of cruelty to animals, if there is any of that there, and if he's had any trauma in his upbringing and how that might play into his mental health as well. He's going to need a very really thorough forensic evaluation, because it's really not clear on the surface if he has any mental illness or not.
We can expect that his defense team will likely be doing whatever they can to cut down what years he's going to serve in prison. He's 21 years old now. Some details about his life came out, as far as living in the woods at one point and not being able to take care of himself. But again, that sentencing happening on September 20th. Coming up, we are going to take... Dr. DeSilva, we're dealing with a different kind of victim here. Usually we have our victims who have lost someone due to the person's negligence or their criminal liability. But here we have victims who are already, their loved ones are already deceased. They believed in the funeral home and what they would do with these remains, but we've just got a different kind of feeling and perspective for these victims who will be taking the stand. There's the grief that's involved. What's your thought on what this must be like for them and what it will be like going through a trial for them?
My heart goes out to these families because not only did they have to endure and go through grief from the initial loss, now they're re-traumatized by the grief coming back again. And then they're traumatized on top of that with this incredible betrayal. Families put their trust in funeral homes and people who take care of their loved ones' remains. And this betrayal is going to be compounded. And when people are traumatized more than once, it's not an additive kind of trauma reaction. It's actually like an exponential traumatic experience. So these families are going to go through a whole lot of trauma. They're going to need a lot of support, both psychological support and probably legal support as well. So my heart just goes out to them. They're really in for a long time of grief, re-grief, the betrayal, the trust building, probably a lot of anxiety. I would expect they might even have depression. They may have bereavement-related depression. They may have nightmares. They may have difficulty trusting other people. So this is going to be very difficult for the families to go through, and the trial is going to be particularly difficult as well.
And difficult indeed. 89 potential victims in this case. So that could mean a lot of them coming into court and testifying.